"Hurry, Jim! Hurry!" The voice was deep, gravelly, and full of urgency. The sound of it pierced the deluge of rain that soaked the already drenched boat. The sudden sound broke the young, dirty-haired boy from his gaping at the monstrosity coming towards him at recklessly high speeds. Jim looked at his father briefly, but couldn't find the willpower to look away from the horse-shaped thing coming at him. If only he had a few more seconds he could see. Jim didn't like what he saw. It seemed to be made from the water at the bottom of the ocean. Dark, cold, lifeless, yet so full of hatred it seemed to possess every inch of its body. James Cruz tried to run away, but he felt like he was wading through waist-deep sludge. His father was still calling. "Come on, I have to move," thought Jim. He looked back over his shoulder, and the beast was still there, ever constant like the rolling of the tide, and with each pulse of its hooves the call came, slowly and unbidden into Jim's mind. "Come along. Come and drown." The voice was deep, yet not harsh. It had a certain lilt to it that he couldn't quite. "Jim, run!" His father broke his concentration by putting his rough, calloused hands on Jim's shoulder and pulling. Jim's father, Robin, was immensely strong due to life at sea as a fisherman, and his grip pulled Jim out of whatever was holding him. "What is that thing?" Jim screamed, the terror of the moment finally getting to him. His father was still pulling him along past the railings, running towards the cabin of the ship. "I can't tell you," came the reply. Jim knew the touch of his father and the sound of his voice like he knew the scent of the crisp sea air. Oddly, both the scent and the sound seemed very off at the moment. Jim ran. He would follow his father anywhere, and trusted him with his whole heart. His father was the only possession he had left. Jim and his father ran around and around the schooner from the monstrous equestrian water fiend in an endless murderous game of Ring Around the Rosies. "Why now?" thought Jim. "I finally convince him to take me out on the sea for the first time since Mother, and this happens. Why now?" "Where do we go?" Jim cried hopelessly. The reply came again, and Jim realized why the voice sounded off. His father was sobbing. I don't know, Jim. I don't know. Just don't let it catch you." As if to concur with Jim's father's statement, the horse whinnied, the sound of it like crashing waves crushing against Jim's eardrums and simultaneously against his will to run. As if he were a puppet to the will of the master, Jim's 8-year-old legs seized. All muscles tightened at once, and he fell helplessly and hopelessly to the ground. His father's grip slipped on his arm, and his father sprawled out in front of him like a seal on the beach. He quickly took a layout of his position and found he was exactly halfway between his father and the horse. But he knew what would catch him first. His father, just like that seal, would be useless at moving fast enough. The horse began to shift, an odd undulating motion. Its body became a tendril of water that somehow retained viscosity. The tendril shot at a speed twice of what the horse was running and encased Jim. The water was pervasive. It longed to kill, to drown. That was its only desire. Water began shoving its way into his nostrils. He opened his mouth to scream, but that sound was cut off by water forcing its way into another open crevice. His ears began popping at the immense pressure, and then came the worst pain he had ever felt. Most people don't think of the eyes as a crevice, but the water wasn't a person. The water pushed and pushed against his eyelids with an unimaginable force. Time seemed to slow as he heard that voice again, this time very soft, yet exceptionally menacing. "Drown!" What seemed before as roaring water now sounded like light rainfall as the reality of death sunk in and Jim's vision darkened. A powerful roar of sheer strength, explosive energy, terrific terror, and fatherly rage broke the pain of Jim's death as Jim's one possession somehow pulled the water beast off of his son. Robin grappled with the beast as watery tendrils began to pull out of Jim and push into his father. With one final bellow of defiance, Jim's father tossed the beast over the side of the boat. The terror was over. Neither of them noticed the 2 tendrils of water still attached to Robin's nose. Robin began to walk towards Jim, a tentative smile forming on his face when his head snapped back, his body went limp, and the water drug him overboard. The sea, seemingly appeased by its sacrifice, finally calmed its tumults. "No!" Jim screamed, his throat raw. "Dad!" His voice broke. By sheer adrenaline, Jim sprung to his feet and from sheer terror was unable to control himself as he walked to the edge of the ship. Through unbelieving eyes, he looked overboard to the waters below and saw nothing. No movement. The water lapped at the edge of the ship like its hunger had been satiated. There was no struggle, no hint that the only man Jim had left had ever existed. A cold, dark emptiness began to fill Jim's heart where a father, his father, once had been. Then, knowing he had nothing left, James Cruz, son of Robin Cruz, gave his very last possession, his tears. The events afterwards were a blur of unfortunate events for Jim. None of the crew saw what had happened, none of the crew saw the horse, and most laughed at him for his childish reasoning at his father's suicide. Jim didn't bother arguing. He knew it would do no good. To those men, Robin Cruz was the not-convicted murderer of his wife, and the guilt finally got to him. Jim just obediently followed those men as they took him to his family's house to gather his things, and then to the orphanage. Jim didn't have any possessions, not anymore. But what he did grab were a picture of his father and mother, smiling, happy, in love, and a book of old stories. He didn't bother to say anything to anyone. Didn't even bother to look at his new surroundings. It seemed the darkness outside matched the darkness inside. So he just flopped down on his new bed and let water overtake him again. A grimy, hole-ridden pair of pirate boots thumped on the deck of the Deep Dweller. Their filth paled in comparison to the man who wore them. Judd Dench was a slimy eel of a man, with a pronounced hooked nose, greasy black hair, an oddly, impeccably groomed beard, and 2 eyes entirely the color of the deepest ocean with no white remaining. The hulking brute of a man lumbered back and forth, shouting commands at his crew. "Lower the sails," he bellowed. "Raise the anchor. It's time to set sail once again." His crew scurried and scuttled about, fulfilling their captain's orders immediately. Judd smiled, showing his lovely yellow teeth. He had worked hard to achieve such impeccable decay. As the ship pulled away from deserted harbor, he sauntered up to the helm, seized it with his foul hands, pulled a lever at its side, and grinned once more as the ship, pulling away, began to sink into the depths. Water rushed over the sides of the ship, pulling it even further into its cold embrace. The ship, however, kept moving, and the crew kept working, each footstep, each action slowing to a drudgery until the crow's nest, finally, disappeared from above the waves. The unfortunate fellow atop the crow's nest began to blubber and groan as the water forced its way into his lungs, completing the ritual required in order to let the rest of the crew survive. Judd grinned to himself. It was hard to find good help nowadays. Ones who would sacrifice themselves so that his miraculous feat could be accomplished. He found that the best way to do so was to promise the unfortunate souls that their families would be well taken care of and never want for anything again. He also found it quite handy not to tell the men that the reason their families would never want for anything was because they were all dead. The water around the Deep Dweller began to slowly change from the crystalline blue of water near the surface with sunlight still streaming through it, towards a navy, then to an indigo, then to the deepest of blacks. The whole of the Deep Dweller began to glow a ghastly green, illuminating the immediate area around the ship. The green light seemed to pervert the water around it, acting like a smoke, slowly lighting up the area as it drifted upwards. The blackness deepened further as a massive shape drifted its way towards the ship. The shape began to undulate back and forth in a multitude of directions all at once, like 100 pieces of seaweed being thrashed about in the most tumultuous tsunami. One strand slowly made its way towards the ship, and as it got closer it became visible in the ethereal green light. A torrent of sea foam salivating profusely from an equine head as large as the Deep Dweller itself. Instead of hair where the mane should be, a sinuous fin ran down a large eel-like neck until it disappeared.
The creature had an otherworldly shine to it, like oil on the surface of water. Not quite black or green or blue or purple, somewhere in between, none of them. Yet all of them at once.
"You've returned,"
the creature bellowed. As it spoke, the sea foam stirred up an undertow that threatened to yank Judd's grip off the helm. He watched, nonchalantly, as his crew disappeared into the depth, and sighed inwardly. He'll have to replace those.
"Our master demands to know why."
Judd's reply was immediate and full of hate. "So he sends a puppet," he sneered. The beast writhed with indignation, stirring up a maelstrom beneath the waves as the head suddenly lunged towards Judd, ready to kill. Its gaping maw revealed massive, pointed teeth, each the size of a man. Sea foam spewed from its mouth as it yelled in indignation and completely engulfed Judd. "So it was this again, was it?" Judd sighed, and walked forward down into the inky blackness of the Perfection's throat. He was accustomed to being eaten, and then into the large stomach chamber. The room glowed with an eerie light shining from the stomach membrane. The light swirled and danced, showering the room with a menagerie of colors from its oil-like sheen. In the center of the stomach, a figure sat cross-legged, seeming to absorb all the light. Judd forced himself to drop to his knees and began his petition. "Your
"Silence,"
the being seethed, standing up from its position. It was vaguely humanoid, with arms and legs, but it was difficult to discern just where the figure began. It fuzzed around the shape like a painting with perfect shading from light to shadow, so flawless, so pristine, so menacing. Judd, completely unfazed, continued. "Your
"Silence,"
the creature uttered again with its otherworldly, calm, almost imperceptible voice that at the same time was so vast. The face that spoke to Judd contained no facial features at all, just a blank slate of pure black.
"If I wished you to speak, I would let you speak. You are treading on sacred ground, a land between realms, my domain. I can do with it and with you whatever I please."
As if to prove a point, dozens of figures shot up around the room as if appearing from nothing, each of them with the same form as the lead figure speaking to Judd. They all took a menacing step toward him.
"You mock me with your mere presence, boy. Your demeanor speaks nothing but lies. If I choose it, you will die where you kneel now. Choose your next words extremely carefully."
"You're failing." Judd gaped and shot at a tendril of blackness protruding from his chest, and his vision faded. Judd started awake in a blackness as deep as the one he had just succumbed to. He felt around his surroundings and felt nothing but damp, moldy wood. So, with no regard to his hands or feet, began pounding on it. With each pound, dirt poured in around him. Not a problem. The land had no sentience, and the breathing ritual should still be imprinted on his soul. After a few hours of discomfort and claustrophobia, Judd's hand pierced through to air, and he pried himself out of the ground. "I hate dying. So damn inconvenient. Now I'll have to get a new crew." He took a look at his new surroundings, and sure enough, it was a typical graveyard. He looked at the headstone of the body his soul had just snatched up. A nobody. It's always a nobody. No matter. This might take a while anyway. He left the grave desecrated and made his way back to the shore. He barked an order in his native tongue and waited. His ship suddenly burst from the water in all its glory. Judging by the color of the waves, the deep was nowhere nearby. So he climbed onto the deck, gripped the helm, and once again plunged into the depths, seeking his prey. Jim? A soft voice permeated the quiet air of the orphanage as Jim's bunkmate, Peter, barely 4 years old, reverently poked Jim's side. Jim moaned quietly but rolled over. He liked Peter enough, but sleep was so beautifully intoxicating. Sleep's sweet caress began to overtake him again, but like a rhinoceros in a glass figurines and antiquities shop, Peter jabbed Jim's face with small, non-coordinated fingers. Ouch! Jim yelped, sitting straight up in bed, and then hitting his head on the top bunk, yelped again. His eyes began to focus, as well as his annoyance, on a very freckled, ginger boy. Peter, Jim groggily mumbled, rubbing his head. It's the middle of the night. What do you think you're... I'm scared, Jim. Peter's small voice interrupted, sounding very frantic. You were, and then there was... I was dreaming again, wasn't I? Yes, and then you were... Jim noticed what Peter was talking about. He was jittery. He was drenched in sweat. He dreamed that horrible dream again. Images started flashing across his mind, horrible, nasty things. His father, the boat, and most of all the horse. That terrible, horrible creature seemed to be everywhere now. As Peter began another one of his 4-year-old fear-induced ramblings, Jim pulled the small child into a firm embrace more for his comfort than the child's, and looked at the familiar sight of 5 other bunks all crammed into an extremely small room. Like the animals on a train car, each bunk was occupied by an orphan who was slowly waking to the unexpected outburst. And then there were the horses! What? Jim whispered intensely. The horses in my dream I was telling you about, they were made of water, Jim! Jim started, awake, terrified. Images of that horrible night pushed intently on his mind as if they could push themselves into reality. Jim fought to hold them back. Not tonight, Jim thought as Peter began to sob in his arms. Go to sleep, Peter, it was only a dream, Jim said while placing the smaller boy back onto his upper bunk. Everything will be all right in the morning. Okay, Jim, Peter replied, his eyes, as well as his voice, drooping due to exhaustion. Good night. Good night. Jim watched intently as Peter's breathing became regular, then stepped back down to his bunk. He laid down and stared intensely at the bunk above him and didn't catch a wink of sleep the whole night long. The orphanage was a dingy 2.5-story building falling apart from top to bottom. The roof's patch job was horrendous, so when it rained, the denizens of the honorary 3rd floor, hereafter to be known as the attic, got a good soaking. Light barely filtered in the room from that small hole in the roof, as the cramped, rectangular room had no windows. The boys on the bottom bunks had life easy, for their only restriction was the bunk above them, while the boys on the top bunk slept cozied up against the roof, a feat only the smaller boys could do. The boys were crammed up there to teach them frugality and living within their means. The floor below the boys was where the girls were. Jim had only seen that room once, and he was amazed at how nice it was. The room was notably brighter because of the window at the far end. Each of the girls had their own bed and space around them. Jim had forgotten about personal space and marveled at why anyone would need it. After seeing the floor only once, Jim had come to one conclusion. Girls are spoiled and rotten. Wake-up call came about 5 minutes after the sun showed itself and was always brought by, in Jim's opinion, the nicest lady ever to walk this earth, Mrs. Lentley. Mrs. Lentley was an ancient lady compared to the boys, being the ripe old age of 56. Despite her age, she was plump and full of smiles. Mrs. Lentley was also the orphanage's maid. Her hair had wisps of gray, but still retained its deep brown color. Her eyes were the same color of brown, and despite the room being so dark, always maintained a twinkle of mischief. Whenever a smile graced her face, it brought with it 2 ginormous dimples right in the center of her cheeks. Her voice perfectly matched her exterior, a thick Cockney accent. Even though she was a missus, Jim knew that she had never been a girl. She was just too nice. Mrs. Lentley always began her rounds at the bunk just to the right of the door, and ended with Jim's and Peter's bunk at the end of the room. She would greet each child by name, and then ever so politely say to the full room, "It's time to get up, wash up, and go downstairs to breakfast. You know how Mrs. Cratchit doesn't like to wait." Then, when Jim would pass her, she always added a little extra. "Honestly, I don't know why people who dislike you little buggers would ever open an orphanage," she added today, completely straight-faced. Then, seeing Jim's incredulous look, burst out in a good, hearty laugh. "Come now, Jim, just a good-natured joke to brighten your day. Jim didn't so much as crack a smile, and so Mrs. Lentley's smile faded as she realized what was going on. "Another rough night, then," she whispered, her voice filled with compassion. Jim just nodded. "It'll be all right, son. Everything'll work out." A nod again. Mrs. Lentley sighed as she watched the boy head out of the room to get ready with the others. She had been around too long to dismiss Jim's nights as a childish fear, but on the other hand, had no idea what to do with it. Then she saw it. Jim's book was open on his bed. She had always been curious of the thing, as it never left the boy's side. It's a miracle that he could read, let alone find time to read as often as he did. She noticed she was getting lost in thought again. "A nasty habit," she thought. "If I get caught, I'd lose my job sure as the sun rises." Mrs. Lentley dismissed all thought of the boy and the book and began her job of cleaning up the room. Jim spit out the water from his mouth, finished his daily routines, and headed down the stairs to breakfast, refusing to let anyone see how rough his night had been. He refused to let his past influence how he acted now, and being a genuinely good-natured kid, quite honestly succeeded. Reaching the second floor, the accursed girls' floor, Jim turned to go down the next flight and almost ran into Peter at the landing. The young boy was Jim's bunkmate. At 4 years old, Peter usually had a dopey grin underneath his mop of ginger hair. This time, however, Peter was staring off into space. "Come on then, Peter, we're going to be late. Goodness knows neither of us want a beating." Jim urged the young boy forward as he spoke, but Peter seemed cemented to the ground. Suddenly, Peter spun around, throwing Jim on his back to the floor, quite the feat for someone as small as Peter was. Jim began to scold the boy, being extremely surprised, but stopped as he saw the glazed look over Peter's eyes. Peter then spoke, but the voice wasn't his. It seemed too old. "It is coming," the voice wheezed out of Peter's lips. And then, as if Jim had imagined it, Peter was back to his normal, happy self. "Hey, Jim, you ready to eat?" Peter grabbed Jim's hand, and before Jim had a chance to reply, tugged him onto his feet and down the stairs. "Absolutely," Jim replied tenuously, but he couldn't help but stare incredulously at his friend. But remembering his breeding, forced himself to stop. After all, one definitely didn't want to be caught gaping while Mrs. Cratchit was around. Upon entering the dining hall, Jim paused to take in the familiar view. The room was on the main floor across from the entrance. Above the door, according to the crab, as the children liked to call Mrs. Cratchit when she wasn't around, nice, spiffy lettering was a sign simply stating, "Food." Above the door, according to Jim, was the most dingy, pathetic sign, still simply stating, "Food." Jim and Peter stepped inside the lunchroom to be greeted by the ordinary sight of nice, orderly rows of tables and chairs on one side, while the other side was completely empty. Naturally, according to the laws, rules, regulations, etc. of Cratchit's home for disparented youngsters, the girls got the tables and the boys, well, didn't. On the far side of the room was the door to the kitchen, and in stark contrast to that door sat the pristine, distinguished office of Mrs. Cratchit, with her looming shadow ominously present, yelling at some poor boy. There was always a boy getting yelled at. Jim heard the girls got a slice of cake. Peter and Jim took their customary places, standing behind two empty chairs, and waited for the girls to get their slop, walk to the chairs, have the boys pull them out, sit down, and start eating, all without saying a simple thank you. After the girls, it was time for, as the crab said, the lesser of the sexes, to get their food. The boys followed through the line at the front of the room to get their food from Mrs. Cratchit's son, the chef. Chef was a good-natured, dark-haired individual, but had an impressively dry sense of humor inversely proportional to the wetness of the food he served. Slowly but surely, Jim made it to the front of the line and said, "What's it to be today, Chef?"
"Well, me boy, here at Crab's Home for Yadder-Yadders, we only serve the finest sludge,"
Chef replied, heaping a big pile of brown goop in a bowl for Jim. Then, handing Jim the bowl, Chef followed with an,
"Enjoy. Oh, and me mum's in a right nasty mood today. Best tread lightly round the leader of the superior gender."
Jim grinned as he took his food back to his customary spot on the floor away from the other boys, and began his customary sit, dread what the food would taste like today, and procrastinate eating a little longer. It was a good routine. worked every... Jim's thoughts were interrupted when the door to the crab's office slammed open, producing the horrid monstrosity of Mrs. Cratchit following close behind. Her big, meaty claws held a cowering boy, Charles, nearly 6 years old, and quite terrified, in their grasp. And for good reason, Jim thought. Seeing the crab every day was always a new experience, given the ridiculous outfits she was prone to wear, today being a bright pink dress flowing down to her feet with an extremely high neckline, but so tight Jim wondered how she could even move and or breathe. But some things were always the same. Mrs. Cratchit was, to put it lightly, hefty. Her big, meaty claws were followed by meatier arms, and the rest of her was a blob of fat that seemed to have no end. Her head melded perfectly with her neck, but the crab's skin was so tight that she had absolutely no wrinkles. Jim, ever the aspiring entrepreneur, quickly jotted the idea down in his mind that the fatter someone was, the less wrinkles they would have, but again was so rudely cut off by the crab's wonderful personality. While Mrs. Lentley was an angel, and most certainly never a girl, Mrs. Cratchit most definitely was.
"And let that be a lesson to all of you boys," she bellowed in utter disgust. "I expect you arriving right on time. Not late, not early, right on time."
She separated those last 3 words for dramatic effect, though from the "yes, ma'am" scattered throughout the orphans, the point had gotten across long before she had even started to talk. Jim thought he saw the slightest inkling of a smile come across Mrs. Cratchit's face, but he shrugged the thought off, for the crab never smiled. Jim glanced again to check, but quick as it came, it left, and with its leaving came more pleasantries.
"And what are you lot staring at?" she boomed. "Back to your food. My son prepared it especially for you."
She finished that last little bit with a sneer towards Chef, turned on her pudgy ankle, and stormed back into her office. The room was unnaturally quiet for a few agonizing seconds until everyone remembered that this was a common routine and went back to their sludge. Jim finally spooned the food into his mouth, chewed, swallowed, had it come back up, and swallowed again. Gagging food down was also a common occurrence in the orphanage, but Jim was impressed because every day the food seemed to get worse. That's why he called Chef, Chef. Only one so talented as a gourmet chef would be able to make something worse every day. Jim spooned another bite and brought it to his lips, ready to savor the disgusting flavor, and paused. Just before the nauseating flavor touched his tongue, he noticed something that made him drop his spoon and spill sludge all over himself. Across the room stood, Jim could hardly believe his eyes, a girl. The girl had shoulder-length brown hair that was completely soaked, dripping water constantly that never seemed to make it to the ground. Her dress was the same, completely drenched. Her eyes were a deep blue, close to black, and seemed dead, yet they were staring straight at him. Her expression was full of fear, and water kept seeping from her partially open mouth. Suddenly, her voice rang through every part of the raucous lunchroom, though her mouth didn't move. "James, help me." As soon as she said those words, she floated from the room into the main lobby area. Jim jumped to his feet and ran after the phantasm. No one stopped him. If they tried, they'd only get a beating from Crab, too. Jim chased the ghost, terrified and excited simultaneously, out the lunchroom door and up the stairs. The drowned girl kept floating away just out of reach, and Jim thought he could still hear her voice in his mind, repeating over and over, each time getting more desperate, more frantic. He kept running up the stairs, skipping a few here and there, failing to notice Peter following him, and the sound of rain slowly echoing each of his footsteps. When he finally reached the third-floor landing, the sound of rain outside had reached tumultuous levels, and he watched helplessly as the girl floated up, then let loose a shriek of pain which racked her body. Jim slammed his hands over his ears and watched in horror as the girl arched her back, whimpering one final time, and began to rain. Droplets of water spilled from her like a thundercloud releasing its burden, taking with them, drop by drop, parts of her body, until she finally disappeared, leaving nothing but a puddle in her stead. Jim ran towards the puddle, completely intrigued and yet a little uneased by what he would see. He didn't realize that with each step the rain got a little heavier. Peter also evaded Jim's gaze as he finally caught up, completely oblivious. When Jim got to where the puddle was, he leaned over it and began to stare into it. He was entranced by how deep the puddle seemed to be. He felt that he could see to the bottom of the ocean itself. And with the writhing the puddle seemed to be doing, the ocean seemed troubled. A bright flash of lightning shone through the halls of the orphanage, illuminating the run-down building in an eerie white light. During the split second the lightning shone, everything changed. Though the building was the exact same, everything seemed more transient, more volatile, more liquid. Jim readied himself to sink into the floor when he found his bearings once more. He turned to go back to the safety of the other children and noticed Peter, limp, pale, and rocking back and forth like a boat on the seemingly solid floor. Jim ran as fast as he possibly could towards Peter, picked up the young child in his arms, and began to sprint to the only potentially safe place he could, the lunchroom. That's when he heard the roar. At first he thought it was thunder, but then it didn't stop. He slowed his sprint and looked over his shoulder at the staircase when he noticed the source of the deafening noise. A gigantic waterfall crept down from the 3rd floor, going down each staircase meticulously, somehow keeping its shape while tumbling over itself in a manically controlled plummet. The destructive force was holding itself back, writhing against gravity itself. When it hit the 2nd floor, the water sent a chute into the girls' room, seeming to search for something. The chute was a neck, and at the end of the neck, Jim saw it, the creature of his nightmares and of his reality, the head of the horse. The horse head apparently didn't find what it was looking for there, and it bellowed in indignation, and then proceeded to form back with the water and head to the 1st floor, straight towards both Peter and Jim. The noise was deafening now to Jim, both to his ears and to his soul. He was filled with an immense dread, but he had a duty to protect his friend. Jim changed his course to the front door of the orphanage while the water crept down the last set of stairs towards him. His limbs felt heavy and his pace slowed as he approached the door. With every step the door seemed to get further away, the water closer and the roar louder. The horse head probe protruded from the mass of water and started its search around the room, sniffing for its prey. Jim froze when he saw the head come towards him. The horse head sniffed his face, soaking Jim completely, and then bellowed, recognizing its prey. The water began to creep inside every opening of his face, from his nostril to his mouth. Blackness began to overtake his vision, and Jim knew it was the end. His last sight was an extremely large woman barreling towards the water ferociously. And the last thing he heard was an unearthly shriek as the horse reeled back in terror.
The stone ground to a halt, and darkness pervaded everything around Kylan as he picked himself up off the ground. "Air above! Did they have to be so violent?" All he said was, "I guess Utopia isn't as perfect as they'd like us to believe." Was it his fault that he was on a pedestal high above the ground, with a sound enhancer on so everyone could hear? He wasn't too harsh with his denunciation of the corrupt. He could have used much worse words than scoundrels, thieves, and what was it? Oh yes, bovine scumheads. He was particularly proud of that last insult. It really rolled off the tongue. Well, even though he didn't deserve it, since he was practically a model citizen, those scumheads had tackled him, roped him up like, well, cattle, and thrown him into the labyrinth. Even though Kylan was a native to Utopia, he had never seen the labyrinth before. He hadn't even dared go to the surface before. He was, after all, human. And being human was one of the biggest imperfections anyone could have. Humans weren't allowed to be seen, so Kylan spent his entire life on the down low, literally. Living in the sewers wasn't exactly glamorous. What irony that the first time he dared to go up, he got himself thrown into it. What a shame that he still hadn't seen it, though. Being unconscious really stank. Trying to ignore his aching head, Kylan was finally able to undo the knots binding his wrists and stood up, waiting for his eyes to adjust until he could see his surroundings. The labyrinth was altogether unimpressive. It was made from simple stones, stacked upon each other to form narrow, uniform hallways. A pale yellow gas hissed between the cracks of stones, casting a glow on the whole cavern. "Ah, winds! What have they done with the air?" Kylan murmured to himself. He was hating these bovine scumheads more by the second as he walked towards the first intersection. He didn't know what he expected to see. Maybe something different than the stone and gas. But apparently this archaeological wonder was exceptionally boring. A bit of discoloration from the gas, even cut stones, and a couple gouges that Kylan assumed were from some other unfortunate soul trapped down here. He chose to walk down the path on the left, continuing in his thoughts of hatred. He was in for a long, long night. A rumble echoed up and down the hallway, and in his head, which was getting fuzzier by the moment. Stone scraped against stone, then banged to the floor. It began slowly at first, then rose to a cacophonous clatter, until the collapsing hallway quickly came to consume the trespasser. Kylan turned, screaming at the top of his lungs, and ran as fast as he could back towards the entrance of the labyrinth. The passageway to the entrance twisted and morphed around itself, forming a spiral. But a dizzying spiral was safer than raining boulders. He threw himself at the stone guarding the entrance, screaming at the guards to let him out, until he realized that the passageway behind him was silent. "I must be quicker than I realized," he thought to cheer himself up. His pounding heart and aching lungs, however, were starting to tell a different truth. He went back to inspect the damage of the collapsed hallway, and was surprised to see that the passageway looked untouched. He looked towards the entrance, and instead saw a collapsed hallway. What in the air? He began a long night of endless drudgery, turning from hallway to hallway, passageway to passageway, coming across dead ends and dead bodies. His head fuzzed more and more as the night went on, but oddly, his vision got clearer and clearer, and his sense of dread lessened until he stumbled upon a passageway, different than all the rest. Lined with majestic vines and flowers of every color imaginable, the passageway opened up to a beautiful quandary of a glorious garden. His thirst overpowering him, Kylan ran towards the stream that went right through the center, dipped his hands into the cool, refreshing liquid, and raised them to his mouth to drink. He coughed as the cruel liquid turned to dust within his mouth. He tried again to no avail. The water taunted him. This was more cruel than anything they'd done yet. Finally, giving up, he let himself slump to the ground, completely overwhelmed. Eventually, the trickling stream lulled him into a fitful sleep.
Kumph! Kumph!
Kylan struggled to open his eyes to see what had caused the disturbance, and gasped. A shining pair of red lights was coming slowly but surely towards him from down the passageway.
Kumph! Kumph!
With each step, the dark being grew closer. The plants around Kylan began to droop, slowly wither, die, and rot.
Kumph! Kumph!
As the beast got closer, Kylan was able to make out the shape of a bull's head atop a man's body, complete with deep, bloodshot, red eyes, and a salivating mouth.
Kumph! Kumph! My brothers, we have meat tonight!
Massive drum beats began in the distance, and each one rattled Kylan to the core. The beast began to sprint towards him, as Kylan struggled to stand and run himself, but his limbs were sluggish. He could not outrun his fate. Bovine scumheads! Roas the mazekeeper knew he shouldn't take pleasure in watching the prey finally be cornered. But he couldn't help but grinning just the slightest as his eyes perused his ancient table with dirt simulacrums, showing exactly what was happening inside the labyrinth, finally falling upon the poor hallucinating human trapped inside. He watched as one of the inferior minotaurs ripped off the human's arm and began to bludgeon the poor fellow with it. He stepped away from his map to look out the window, overseeing the labyrinth. Such a beautiful view, so perfect. He loved this place. He loved Utopia, where everyone belonged, and the ones that didn't, well, they could feed his brothers. It was hard to imagine that such barbarous activities ever went on here, but the public need not know about them. I wonder what this poor fool saw before he died. Roas had never been in the labyrinth himself, but he knew the effects the gas could have on the mind. After all, he designed it. He returned to his simulacrum table to watch the rest of the proceedings, as the minotaurs hauled away their prey, built a fire, and proceeded to enjoy their meal. Air above, this is fun! Now we have to see if he's corrupted anyone. We're going to bring something brand new to you guys. Here is a brand new episode of Castaways.
Jim! Mrs. Cratchit's voice echoed through the whole house like a steam train in a, small metal chamber. You better hurry or you're going to be late. Jim rushed down the stairs, nearly tripping along the way, briefcase in hand, clutching a cap on his head that matched his tweed suit. He idly noted that years ago the sound of Mrs. Cratchit screaming would have filled him with terror, but it now filled him with fondness, and yes, still a little bit of terror. 18 years old now, his hair had darkened to a light brown, nicely trimmed, which he wore over a clean-shaven face. I'm coming, he replied. He hopped down to the bottom step with a huff and was greeted by Mrs. Cratchit coming around the corner from the living room. She hadn't changed much over the years after she took him in. She still had the big, meaty paws, but Jim now knew them for their soft, tender hugs. She bustled around Jim, checking the cut of his suit, tisking to herself lightly while going over her work. Every once in a while she would laundry list items off to Jim, quadruple checking that he had everything he would need for his upcoming journey. Jim would respond with his obligatory, "Yes, Mrs. Cratchit's," and "You've already checked that." But he didn't mind. He suffered her prodding and questions with a genuine smile. He would miss this woman and her motherly instincts. She had proven herself to be a true friend, especially after Peter had disappeared. And if standing here letting her fuss was how he could repay her, he would gladly do so. Mrs. Cratchit suddenly stopped her prodding and poking around to stand up and look up at him with worry showing in her eyes as a lone tear streaked down her cheek. "Jim, are you sure you want to do this? I mean, the Titanic and going to America?" He had had an overactive imagination since he was a child, to the point of convincing himself that a horse made of water had been the source of all his problems, when that logically couldn't be the case. Jim nodded, letting his grin fade to a more serious expression. He had to do this, had to prove to himself that the world made sense and that his childish imaginings were nothing more than just that. "Then you promise me that you'll be careful?" "I will, ma'am." "And you'll write?" "Of course, ma'am." "Make sure to eat 3 meals a day?" "Wouldn't miss them, ma'am." "And Jim?" "I love you, son." Jim responded with a massive bear hug to this woman who he started out hating and fearing, but now had naught but affection for. I love you too. Their parting completed, Jim grabbed his briefcase, which he had inadvertently dropped, gave one last little wave, and ran out the door into the bustling street beyond. He blinked at the light as he greeted the familiar sights and sounds of the cobbled streets with horse-drawn carriages, and idly wondered what it would be like if a horse actually sat down at an easel to draw a carriage. He signaled for a cab, told them to go to the Southampton docks, and began his long, bumpy ride towards destiny. As the carriage eventually pulled up to the docks, Jim gasped at the overwhelming size of the ship he was about to get on. He felt positively dwarfed by the impregnable dreadnought before him. He felt like an ant basking in the presence of an elephant, gawking at the sheer monstrous size. Wait. What on earth does elef mean? And why does that separate an ant from an elephant? He physically shook himself out of his odd mental musings, jumped out of the trotting carriage, tossed payment up to the shocked driver, and shouted his thanks. He had to get a closer look. The next hour until boarding was a blur of alternatively marveling at the impressive engineering and the quality and quantity of people waiting to board. He rushed this way and that, trying to take in everything he could. He shook while waiting in line, the anticipation practically killing him. He used his entire life savings to have this opportunity, and so far it was completely worth it. He even met 3 nice young ladies, all named Kate, while waiting to board. He positively knew he was in for the time of his life. After boarding, he clambered to the port side railing to look out over the sea. It was just about noon now, so the sea was alight with the glinting sun. One wave pristinely reflected a glint of sunlight into his eyes that he idly thought looked like the form of a woman underneath the waves. He shrugged the thought off when he heard a tumultuous clamor coming from the other side of the ship. Eager to see what the noise was, he began wrapping his way around to the other side, the glint of the sun leaving a greenish image of a woman every time he blinked. The noise got louder and louder the closer he got to it until it finally resolved into the image behind the sound. A veritable mob of people were crowding the railings, so Jim had a hard time seeing what they were yelling at with such excitement. Worming his way through the crowd and the noise, he finally saw it. If the people on the boat were a mob, the people on the ground were bigger mob. An army. Why didn't I think of army first? Jim thought. The dock was crowded with fathers and mothers waving goodbyes to children, families upon families, each in different stages of life, all clamoring to say goodbye. Some children jumping up and down, some elderly smiling and waving. Some people precariously leaned over the railing of the ship as if trying to get close enough to give one last hug to their families. The cacophony of goodbyes threatened to overwhelm Jim's senses when a sudden "bop" drowned out all noise as the ship itself bellowed its goodbye. As the Titanic began to pull away from the dock, loved ones in both areas moved en masse, either running down the dock or around the railings to try to catch a last glance of each other before the remarkable journey. Jim gave a fond smile and waved to the crowd, somehow feeling liberated with the chance to get away from civilization for a while, and watched as the ship moseyed its way out of port, deeper into the sea, and far enough away that the land was barely more than a pinprick on the horizon. After a quick tour of his beautiful new surroundings, from the succulent dinner at the dining hall and the dancing afterwards, Jim eventually found his way to his room and began unpacking, still dreaming about the wonders of the ship he was on, and eventually found his way to the bed for the night. He grinned as the ship slowly drifted through the ocean, letting him drift off to sleep with it. Yes, he thought, this will be an adventure.